Imagine waking up one morning with the strange sensation that someone has been following you for years. Not a stalker in the ordinary sense, but a presence woven into your every decision, lurking in the hesitation before you speak, whispering in the silences you avoid. At first you might dismiss it as a dream, a trick of the mind, but then you notice it again when you hesitate to tell the truth, when you betray your own desire just to fit in, when you laugh at a joke that secretly wounds you. This figure is always there, watching, silent, yet impossibly close. You try to ignore it, to bury it, but the more you turn away, the heavier it grows. Now, what if I told you this presence isn't a ghost, isn't a hallucination, but is in fact yourself? Not the self you proudly present to the world, not the one dressed in accomplishments and polite smiles, but the dark double you've spent a lifetime denying. Carl Jung called this hidden presence the shadow, and he argued that you cannot truly know who you are until you dare to face it. The paradox is brutal. The very things you disown, the anger you suppress, the envy you deny, the impulses you judge as shameful, are not your enemy, but your mirror. And yet, to look into that mirror is terrifying. Who wants to admit they are capable of cruelty, of selfishness, of betrayal? Who wants to admit that behind their righteousness hides a hunger for power, or that beneath their kindness lurks resentment? We tell ourselves we are civilized, evolved, decent, but Jung would whisper back, then why does the monster always return? This is the haunting paradox that shakes the foundations of our self-image. The more we refuse to acknowledge the darkness within, the more it controls us from the shadows. Think about it. How many times have you seen someone explode with rage and say afterward, "I don't know what came over me"? How many scandals upped because a leader preaches morality in public but lives a secret life of excess and corruption? How many betrayals happen not because someone planned them coldly, but because repressed desires surged forward when they least expected? Each time we deny the existence of the shadow, we become its puppet. But here is where the true unease sets in. What if the shadow is not only the reservoir of our worst traits, but also the hidden container of our deepest strengths? Jung believed that within the rejected parts of ourselves lie not only shame and guilt, but also creativity, freedom, and vitality. The shadow is both the dungeon and the treasure chest. Imagine the strange irony. The very qualities you most fear in yourself might be the ones you need to become whole. What if your anger, when faced honestly, could fuel your courage? What if your envy could show you the map to your unlived potential? What if the parts of yourself you are most desperate to silence are the same ones holding the key to your destiny? This question unsettles because it cannot be answered quickly. It requires something far more uncomfortable than philosophy. It requires you to stop running from yourself. To confront the shadow is to confront the truth that you are not only light but also darkness, not only noble but also animal, not only innocent but capable of every cruelty you condemn in others. How do you bear that weight without collapsing? How do you face yourself without losing yourself? And most dangerously, what if you refuse? Because here is the quiet terror. The shadow does not disappear just because you look away. If unacknowledged, it seeps into your relationships, sabotages your dreams, and silently molds the life you live. You may think you chose your path, but perhaps it was chosen by the parts of you you've locked in the basement. You may think you are free, but perhaps you are most enslaved to the very impulses you have never named. So Jung's great question is not whether you have a shadow. You do. The question is whether you dare to meet it before it devours you from the inside out. And so the great question lingers, tightening around your mind like smoke you cannot wave away. If the shadow is both your prison and your possibility, what happens if you never open the door? The first temptation when confronted with the idea of the shadow is denial. You think, surely, you are not as divided as all that. Surely you know yourself, at least well enough to recognize your flaws. But denial is precisely the shadow's camouflage. The very claim that "I am not like that" is often the signature that you are. This is the hidden problem. Our minds are not unified palaces, but fractured landscapes, filled with rooms we refuse to enter. Carl Jung warned that everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Yet why do we resist? Why do we prefer ignorance to integration? The answer lies deep in our psychology, in the ancient and modern forces that have shaped us. From the earliest days of childhood, we learn that certain behaviors bring love, while others bring punishment. Cry too loudly, and you're scolded. Express jealousy, and you're shamed. Admit hatred, and you are called bad. In these fragile years, survival depends on approval, and approval is bought at the cost of authenticity. We craft a mask, the persona, that wins affection and shields us from rejection. But every mask has a cost. The emotions, desires, and impulses that don't fit are pushed down into the cellar of the psyche. You become the child who smiles when you want to scream, the student who excels while dying inside, the adult who looks composed but carries storms beneath the surface. You learn to hide your shadow, not because you are evil, but because you are human. The tragedy is that what began as survival calcifies into identity. You forget there is a mask at all. Philosophy helps us understand why this denial is so intoxicating. Friedrich Nietzsche once said, "Every deep thinker is more afraid of being understood than of being misunderstood." Why? Because to be understood means to have one's contradictions laid bare. Nietzsche argued that humans crave illusions, not truth, because illusions protect us from the unbearable knowledge of what we are. To recognize your shadow is to recognize not only your failures, but also your untamed hunger, your animal nature, your capacity for both brilliance and destruction. Civilization itself depends on suppressing these drives. We build laws, religions, and social norms not just to guide us, but to keep the shadow locked away. To be civilized is, in some sense, to pretend that we are simpler, cleaner, more rational than we really are. Arthur Schopenhauer went further, describing life itself as driven by blind, insatiable will. According to him, human beings are never at peace because beneath every conscious desire lies a darker, unconscious striving, an endless craving that cannot be satisfied. What Jung later described as the shadow can be understood, through Schopenhauer's lens, as the unacknowledged reservoir of this will. We chase pleasure, success, or morality, thinking we are noble in our aims, but beneath each pursuit lies a darker, irrational force driving us. We are puppets who mistake the strings for freedom. But psychology adds another layer. Modern research into cognitive biases reveals how often we deceive ourselves without knowing it. Consider the confirmation bias, our tendency to seek information that confirms what we already believe, or the self-serving bias, where we credit ourselves for success but blame external factors for failure. These are not harmless quirks. They are defense systems designed to protect us from the painful truth of our shadow. When you lash out at someone, you tell yourself they provoked you. When you envy a friend, you disguise it as concern. When you crave recognition, you rename it as humility. These rationalizations are the shadow's fingerprints. Even Jean-Paul Sartre's notion of bad faith reveals how deeply entangled we are in self-deception. Sartre argued that human beings flee from their own freedom by pretending they are victims of circumstance. You say, "I had no choice," when in reality you feared the choice before you. This refusal to own our freedom is another form of refusing the shadow, for to admit your choices are yours is to admit the shadow's role in them. Sartre insisted that authenticity requires brutal honesty, but honesty about oneself is the very thing we dread. Here lies the deeper paradox. We hide our shadow not only out of fear of what others will think, but out of fear of what we will think. The confrontation is too intimate. If you admit your shadow, you admit that the enemy you fought outside may live inside. You admit that the cruelty you condemn in history, in politics, in others, also flickers in your own eyes. And if that is true, then morality becomes less about judging and more about understanding, less about purity and more about integration. But this is unbearable for many, because we want to believe we are good, that evil is always out there. The shadow whispers, "No, it is in here." Aldous Huxley once warned that men do not learn very much from the lessons of history, and that is the most important of all the lessons of history. Why? Because history itself is the shadow of humanity. Every atrocity we claim could never happen again hides in the potential of every society. Every cruelty we condemn as inhuman is, in truth, profoundly human. We repress this knowledge because it threatens the illusion of progress. Yet, as Jung argued, until the individual confronts his own darkness, society will continue to replay it in endless cycles. Wars, scarpegs, oating, oppression, they are not accidents, but projections of the shadow onto the world stage. The hidden problem, then, is not merely psychological, but existential. The shadow exists because to be human is to be divided. We are at once spirit and flesh, dreamer and animal, light and darkness. To deny the shadow is to deny half of what you are. But to face it is to risk unraveling the fragile identity you have spent a lifetime constructing. No wonder most people turn away. It is easier to live in fragments than to face the whole. Easier, but not without cost. Because the shadow you refuse to meet will not vanish. It waits, and if you do not confront it, it will confront you. So the question grows sharper. If our very nature, from childhood to society to philosophy itself, conspires to keep us blind to the shadow, what hidden consequences does this blindness unleash in our daily lives? The most haunting truth about the shadow is that it does not wait politely for permission to appear. You may bury it under years of discipline, disguise it with the finest manners, or distract yourself with endless entertainment, but repression is never annihilation. It is only redirection. The shadow, denied a seat at the table of consciousness, creeps in through the back door. It leaks into your voice when you speak in anger you didn't mean. It appears in dreams as figures you despise or fear. It shapes the choices you make without ever asking for your consent. And perhaps the greatest tragedy is that you don't even know it's happening. You believe you are in control, when in reality the shadow is steering from the dark. On the personal level, the consequences are subtle but devastating. Think of projection, a mechanism Jung described as one of the primary ways the shadow operates. You refuse to admit your own aggression, so you become convinced that everyone around you is hostile. Why? You bury your envy, so you grow obsessed with the supposed arrogance of others. You deny your desire for recognition, so you condemn the ambition of your peers. In this way, your shadow turns the world into a distorted mirror, reflecting back the parts of yourself you cannot bear to see. The irony is cruel. The traits you find most intolerable in others are often the very ones you secretly harbor. You rage at dishonesty, but perhaps you lie to yourself. You condemn selfishness, but maybe your kindness is tinged with vanity. Thus, relationships are poisoned not by what others truly are, but by what you cannot accept in yourself. The consequences stretch deeper still. The shadow does not merely haunt individuals, it shapes entire cultures. Cognitive science shows how biases are not just private quirks, but collective tendencies. When a society represses its own darkness, its violence, greed, lust for domination, it does not vanish. It erupts in mass hysteria, witch hunts, political scapegoating, and wars. Consider how easily nations blame outsiders for their misfortunes. The foreigner becomes the thief of jobs, the heretic becomes the cause of famine, the immigrant becomes the symbol of decay. This is projection on a grand scale. A culture that cannot admit its own failures finds a scapegoat to carry them. And so the shadow of the collective, when denied, spills blood. History itself reads like a long chronicle of shadow denial. Think of the medieval church, preaching chastity while its leaders lived in indulgence. Think of the revolutions that promised liberty yet descended into terror. Think of modern democracies that celebrate equality while quietly perpetuating exploitation. In each case, the idealized persona of the group, pious, free, just, concealed a shadow it refused to face. Nietzsche once declared that madness is rare in the individual, but in groups, parties, nations, and epochs it is the rule. What he intuited is what Jung explained. The larger the group, the easier it is to project the shadow outward and lose oneself in the illusion of purity. But the unseen consequences are not only external, they corrode the very core of our lives. When you refuse to confront your shadow, you live in fragmentation. You feel an unnamed emptiness, as if half your soul were locked away. You may achieve success, but it feels hollow. You may maintain relationships, but they lack depth. Why? Because intimacy requires honesty, and honesty requires shadow work. To love another is to admit your vulnerability, jealousy, and neediness. But if you cannot face those traits in yourself, you can never truly open. Likewise, creativity demands risk, chaos, and imperfection, all qualities lurking in the shadow. If you silence them, you silence your originality. In trying to be flawless, you become lifeless. The neuroscientific perspective only sharpens the picture. Research on repression suggests that when emotions are pushed out of awareness, they do not disappear. Instead, they manifest in the body. Stress, anxiety, and psychosomatic illness often trace their roots not to external pressures, but to the unacknowledged storms within. The body becomes the battlefield where the shadow makes itself known. You may not allow yourself to feel rage, but your heart pounds and your stomach knots. You may not admit despair, but your immune system weakens. The shadow will speak one way or another, and if you will not listen, it will carve its message into flesh. And then comes perhaps the darkest consequence. When the shadow is ignored too long, it doesn't simply whisper through dreams or tug at relationships, it erupts in what Jung called possession. This is when the repressed part of the psyche takes full control, and you become the very thing you denied. The loving parent who suddenly abuses, the trusted leader who betrays, the calm friend who snaps with inexplicable violence. These are not random aberrations, but moments when the shadow, hishkash, having been silenced too long, seizes the stage. Jung compared it to being overrun by an autonomous complex, a force within that feels alien because it was never integrated. At that point, the shadow is not just hidden, it is driving. Think about your own life. How many times have you done something that shocked even you? Words you swore you'd never say, actions you promised you'd never take. In those moments, the question arises, was that truly me? The unsettling answer is yes, but it was the part of you refused to know. The consequence of denial is fragmentation, and fragmentation makes you a stranger to yourself. To live without meeting your shadow is to live as a ghost in your own story. And yet, even in this darkness, there is a hidden signal. For Jung, the shadow was not merely an enemy, but a messenger. Its eruptions, painful as they are invitations. They are the psyche's way of saying, look here at what you fear, look here at what you repress, look here, because until you do, you will never be whole. The unseen consequences are devastating, but they are also the call to courage. The shadow is not a curse. It is the unclaimed half of your humanity, which leaves us standing at the threshold of a dangerous question. If the shadow cannot be destroyed, if it erupts whenever ignored, then what remains? Is there a way to face it, not as an enemy, but as a guide? And if so, what would it demand of you? The rebellion. How to break free. To break free is not to escape the shadow, but to walk straight into its labyrinth with eyes unblinking. The rebellion begins not with conquest, but with courage. The courage to admit that the figure haunting you in dreams, the stranger lurking in your anger, the voice you've silenced in shame, is you. Jung insisted that wholeness does not come from chasing light alone, but by embracing both poles, the saint and the sinner, the noble and the animal. Yet here lies the shock. The very act of acceptance feels like treason against the self you've carefully construed. The rebellion, therefore, is not against society or circumstance, but against the comfortable lie of your own persona. It is the revolt of authenticity against illusion. But how does one begin such a rebellion without collapsing into chaos? The first act is to stop running. Instead of dismissing anger, envy, fear, or lust as bad, you turn toward them with the curiosity of an archaeologist uncovering a buried city. You ask, what does this anger reveal about what I truly value? What does this envy point to in my unlived potential? What does this fear protect me from? Suddenly, the shadow transforms from a monster into a map, each dark impulse marking the coordinates of your disowned truth. Jung wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. To break free is not to destroy the shadow, but to let its voice be heard. This rebellion is radical because it reverses the logic of society itself. From birth you were taught to hide your flaws, to polish your image, to keep your dark side a secret. But integration requires you to confess it, to yourself first, and perhaps later to others. Imagine what it would mean to admit without shame, yes, I am capable of cruelty. and then to explore that capacity with responsibility rather than denial. Imagine what it would mean to admit, yes, I crave recognition, and then to channel that craving into creativity rather than gossip or sabotage. The rebellion is not in indulging the shadow, but in facing it without disguise. To see clearly is the first taste of freedom. Historical examples reveal the power of this shift. Consider the samurai of medieval Japan, who meditated daily on their own deaths. By confronting the most feared shadow, the inevitability of mortality, they stripped it of its power. Or think of the Stoic philosophers, like Seneca, who urged their stud, hence to imagine the loss of all they loved, not to breed despair, but to deepen gratitude and resilience. These practices echo Jung's insight. Only by looking directly at what terrifies you can you live without being secretly ruled by it. Integration is not about becoming darker, but about dissolving fear through recognition. Yet the rebellion requires a particular kind of honesty. It is not enough to say, I know I have flaws, and move on. That is still a mask. Real confrontation demands specificity. What flaw? What desire? What betrayal have you imagined? What secret hunger have you carried? Jung emphasized the work of shadow journaling, dream analysis, and active imagination, methods of entering dialogue with the shadow rather than suppressing it. In active imagination, one might literally sit in silence and speak with the inner figure that appears in dreams, asking what it wants, why it lingers. It sounds strange, even unsettling, but this willingness to give form to the shadow is a declaration of rebellion. I will not pretend anymore. Philosophically, the rebellion is the rejection of bad faith, as Sartre called it. Bad faith is the lie we tell ourselves to escape freedom. I had no choice, that's just who I am. To rebel is to say, no, I choose to confront the part of me that chooses. It is to take radical responsibility, not in the shallow sense of blaming yourself for everything, but in the deeper sense of owning the totality of who you are. This is terrifying because it removes excuses. If you are both light and dark, then you cannot hide behind the fantasy of purity. You must own your cruelty as much as your kindness, your envy as much as your generosity. But paradoxically, this ownership is what makes freedom real. The rebellion also requires the humility to see that shadow work never ends. Jung believed integration was a lifelong process. The shadow is not something you conquer once and banish. It evolves as you evolve. Each new stage of life reveals new aspects hidden in the dark. The rebellion, then, is not a single act, but a way of living, a daily refusal to turn away from what is difficult. It is the habit of asking yourself not just, what do I show the world, but what am I hiding from myself today? The rewards of this rebellion, though, are profound. To integrate the shadow is to unlock the energy that repression has trapped. Anger, once denied, becomes the fuel for courage and boundary setting. Envy, once condemned, becomes a compass pointing to your unlived potential. Fear, once paralyzing, becomes wisdom about where your vulnerabilities lie. Even the darker fantasies, the impulses you would never act upon, can reveal truths about the complexity of human desire, expanding your empathy toward others. Integration makes you not perfect but whole, and wholeness is stronger than purity because it cannot be shattered by a single failure. But perhaps the most liberating outcome of rebellion is authenticity. When you are no longer ruled by the need to hide, you can live without constant fear of exposure. Your kindness becomes real because it is no longer a mask. Your love becomes deeper because it is no longer dependent on denying your flaws. Jung believed that the individual who integrates their shadow not only transforms themselves, but becomes a light for society, breaking the cycle of projection and scapegoating. To rebel against your own illusions is, in a sense, the most revolutionary act you can commit. Still, the question lingers, sharper now. If rebellion means facing the shadow and embracing its lessons, what lies beyond integration? Is there a final truth waiting after the rebellion? A truth that does not merely free us from the shadow, but redefines the very meaning of being human? The ultimate truth. The final, most powerful realization. Imagine for a moment standing in front of a mirror that does not rise. Reflect your appearance, but your entire being, your memories, your choices, your impulses, the light you've cultivated and the darkness you've denied. At first you recoil. You see betrayal, pettiness, cowardice. You see all the things you hope to bury. But then, as your gaze steadies, something astonishing happens. Behind the ugliness, there is vitality, a raw current of life that feels more authentic than any mask you have ever worn. This is the ultimate truth Jung was pointing to, that the shadow, once faced, does not destroy you, but completes you. To find yourself is not to ascend into some pristine realm of eternal light, but to weave together the broken halves of your humanity until they form a whole. The final realization is simple, and yet it overturns everything. You are not just the parts of yourself you approve of. You are the totality, the saint and the sinner, the creator and the destroyer, the frightened child and the eternal spirit. To live divided is to live half alive. To live whole is to embrace contradiction as the very essence of existence. The philosophical weight of this realization is staggering. Nietzsche's call to become who you are was not an invitation to cultivate only your noble virtues, but to embrace the chaos that makes you alive. To become who you are is to stop playing the impossible game of purity and instead to dance with your contradictions until they reveal their hidden music. Schopenhauer's bleak vision of life as endless will find new light here. Yes, desire is endless, but to accept your shadow is to accept desire without illusion, to see craving not as a curse, but as part of the pulse of existence. Sartre's existentialism, too, sharpens under this lens. If bad faith is the denial of your freedom, then the ultimate truth is the embrace of it in its full terror. You are free not only to choose, but to acknowledge the darkness in your choosing. Freedom is not clean. It is messy, ambiguous, heavy. And yet only in carrying that weight do you stand fully upright as a human being. Psychologically, this realization transforms suffering. Much of human pain is amplified by resistance. You feel rage, but you deny it. You feel envy, but you disguise it. You feel fear, but you label it weakness. Each act of denial fractures you further, creating endless inner conflict. The ultimate truth dissolves that battle. To say, yes, I am envious, is to rob envy of its poison. To admit, yes, I am afraid, is to discover that courage is not the absence of fear, but its companion. The shadow loses its tyranny the moment you cease pretending it isn't there. Suddenly, even your flaws become teachers. Shame becomes humility. Rage becomes clarity. Grief becomes depth. By integrating the shadow, you discover that wholeness is not perfection, but the ability to carry both light and dark without tearing yourself apart. But this truth extends beyond the personal. If individuals embraced their shadow, societies would change. Projection, the endless scapegoating of enemies, the constant blame placed on outsiders, would lose its grip. Collective atrocities often begin with the refusal of a people to admit their own flaws. If each person took responsibility for their darkness, the need to demonize the other would fade. Jung believed the fate of humanity depended on this inner work, warning that the world will ask you who you are, and if you do not know, the world will tell you. In other words, if you do not integrate your shadow, you will project it, and history will repeat its nightmares. The ultimate truth is not just individual salvation, but collective survival. And yet, perhaps the deepest layer of this realization is spiritual. Every great tradition, in its own way, has spoken of wholeness. Christianity speaks of confession and redemption. Buddhism teaches the integration of opposites, the middle path that transcends duality. Taoism symbolizes it through yin and yang, the dark and the light, flowing into each other in endless balance. Jung's shadow is not merely psychological, it is archetypal, echoing ancient wisdom to meet,